Hello and welcome to the Japan Politics Podcast, and this week we're discussing the big news that's just happened, which is that the Prime Minister of Japan, in the last couple of days, Shigeru Ishiba, has just resigned. Now, why has this happened, and in particular, why now? Well, I'd say in general his decision to resign has been led by him having a bit of a tough year or so in the office of Prime Minister. Now, when he became the leader of the LDP, Shigeru Ishiba, and as a result Prime Minister, he made a bold decision to immediately call an election. Not long after, and the LDP at the time were suffering from a couple of scandals, the church scandal, the slush fund scandal, and as a result, he had a bit of a bad election in 2024, and ended up losing the party's majority in the lower house. Now, he wasn't immediately forced out by the LDP after that, I think largely because a lot of the blame for the election defeat went to the LDP, and sort of the scandals, whereas Ishiba came in as sort of an outsider, a bit of a critic of the Abe faction who'd been in charge up until then, or been in charge part of the time up until then, and so he maybe got a little bit of a pass for that election loss. But since then, things have been difficult for him because he's not had a majority. He's sort of struggled to get maybe all the legislation he'd want to through Parliament. He's had to work with other parties and sort of compromise. And so he's had a bit of a tough time because of that. He's had things like the rice crisis, which is affecting ordinary Japanese families. It's making it harder to buy rice. There's a shorter supply. It's more expensive. It's adding to a cost of living difficulty in Japan. And there's been also things like the gift scandal, where Ishiba's reputation personally was hurt by the accusation, although he denied any wrongdoing, that he'd been giving out gifts. And then very recently, in the last few months, he had a second election in 2025, this time in the upper house. And once again, he ended up losing the LDP's majority. Combined with Komeito and LDP, he lost the majority in the upper house. And I think this election's been pinned much more on Ishiba. He's had a year at the job now. And I think really these difficulties he's faced in office and then the loss of that election have really been leading towards speculation and pressure to resign. And ultimately, he's done so. Now, why is he chosen now in particular to resign? I'd say there are two main reasons that I can think of. Number one, the day after he resigned, there was a meeting scheduled where there was potentially going to be a vote that would have forced a special leadership election in the LDP, which would have meant that Ishiba would have had to either stand down or potentially face the indignity of having been the leader of the LDP, having to go through the contest and see off challengers, so maybe there was an element of him jumping before he was pushed in that respect, and that meeting's, I think, been on the cards ever since the 2025 election loss. And there's also the fact that he's just sealed a deal with Trump, and so if he'd left before then, it would have been negative for Japan because it would have risked the negotiation with Trump, and that would have risked the deal stalling or maybe even not happening, which would have exposed Japan to a lot of uncertainty, and it would have meant whoever came in to replace him would have then had to struggle to get to grips with and go in the middle of an already existing negotiation. And so it would have disadvantaged Japan maybe if he'd gone before that trade deal was done. And also, it's a nice string to his bow. Ishiba can say, well, I've gone out on a high note, having accomplished this trade deal. And it sort of adds to a more positive legacy, having got the trade deal done, and now he can leave on somewhat of a high on a time of his choosing. So perhaps good timing in that respect to leave after the trade deal being concluded and before this meeting that would have forced him out. How will he be remembered? That's sort of difficult to say. He's had a lot of difficulties. He's only been in office for a year or so. I think perhaps he'll be remembered as been a bit unlucky in having to deal with a lot of difficult circumstances at once. He came in dealing with a crisis of a lack of faith in the LDP, having followed these scandals, which was not of his own doing. He wasn't within the Abe faction or really in power while these scandals were happening, but nonetheless he chose to run, and so he's sort of tarred by association with them and having to go in and try and reform the LDP's reputation. And he's unlucky to have faced a lot of difficulty with the rice crisis and having to deal with Trump suddenly declaring tariffs on Japan. That's rather unexpected. And so he's had, a bit of bad luck in that respect, and he's sort of managed to hold things together and get a trade deal with Trump done. So perhaps he'll be remembered a bit more favourably because of that. I think the big thing that's made his time in office difficult was his decision to call this early election. I suppose maybe he had to do that to get control of the party and give himself his own mandate. but that's really made things more difficult for his time in office because he had to deal with a minority government and had a much harder time making decisions and getting things through. But I think perhaps he'll be remembered as being a little bit unlucky in the amount of things he had to deal with in his short year. And rather than dragging things out, he's just, got the trade deal done and sort of quietly he's leaving. Is there a possibility of Ishiba mounting a comeback and returning as Prime Minister in the future? It's not completely ridiculous in Japanese politics. I mean, famously, Shinzo Abe left and then years later came back and regained the leadership of the LDP and became Prime Minister a second time and had a very long time in office, having returned. In Ishiba's case, I maybe fail to see it. There's a factor of his age, 68, but that's not, when you think about people like Trump and Biden so old these days, there's perhaps time for him to stay on and make a comeback. I think the really decisive thing is that he has run already 5 times to become Prime Minister. His 5th attempt was the successful one that got him elected, and he did at the time say that this was going to be his final attempt to be Prime Minister. So he sort of penned himself in with that statement, and I think maybe that indicates that it's relatively unlikely he'll make a comeback. But nonetheless, he's, like I say, been able to leave on somewhat of a high in that respect and on the time of his own choosing. And so, we wish him the best, of course. What happens now? Well, because the LDP, although they are a minority government, they are comfortably the largest party within the lower and upper houses of Japan. It's very, very likely that they'll just comfortably be able to choose the next Prime Minister. That seems very likely. And so whoever becomes the new leader of the LDP will just likely become the next Prime Minister. And so there'll be a special election to choose the leader of the LDP. And I believe that will be decided by October 4th. So they've got a best part of a month or so to go through the process of candidates deciding if they want to enter the fray, sizing people up, see what level of support they have before entering, and we'll, I imagine, relatively soon know who the full candidate list will be, and that'll be quite interesting to see who emerges in the top in this leadership race and to become the next Prime Minister. So that leads me on to sort of speculate wildly about who the candidates for this LDP leadership election, and by extension the next Prime Minister of Japan, could be. Well, you have to, of course, mention people who are being speculated a lot. I've mentioned them in the past. I've seen wildly them saying that there's 2 primary frontrunners and very different candidates who also finished second and third to Ishiba in the 2024 leadership election. And so it appears that people are expecting history to largely repeat itself and people who did well last time to do well again. The first is Sanae Takaichi. I've talked about her a lot on the show. She was the frontrunner against Ishiba in 2024, but in the end, in the runoff, didn't win and sort of lost that initial front-runner status she has. And so she can maybe say, oh, well, perhaps Ishiba's only lasted a year. He made this bad mistake of calling an early election, lost another election. Maybe on what you should have gone with the first time. She can make that claim. Sanae Takaichi is sort of more from the right wing of the party, sort of an Abe, more of the Abe side, the faction side of the LDP, and so she can sort of make a claim, given that in the 2025 election, Sanzeto had their big breakthrough moment where they became the 3rd or 4th largest party, I believe, and they called themselves the LDP of the good old days. They got a lot of votes potentially from the LDP, and they've been drawing off maybe support from the LDP's traditional base, sort of the more right wing of the party, voters. Maybe she can make a claim that she can stop that flow of energy and votes going towards Sanzeto and potentially secure the future of the LDP and stop their bit of a decline in that direction by leaning towards the right of the party and stopping votes escaping there and shoring things up that way. And so it'll be... it's widely speculated that she's going to enter this election as well, and so it'll be interesting to see if she does that and how she fares. The other lead potential frontrunner is Shinjiro Koizumi. We've talked about him also a bit recently. He's more of a sort of centrist, not so far side to the right of the LDP party. Now, he also ran against Ishiba and was potentially very pivotal in Ishiba in the end, defeating Sanae Takaichi and becoming Prime Minister for the last year because he sort of pushed support his way. Now, he didn't initially join Ishiba's cabinet, but he did very recently. In the last few months, he's sort of taken a very prominent, important media role, because there's been this rice crisis and there's a shortage, so that's making it harder to get and more expensive for ordinary families in Japan to get rice. He's taken on that role, and he's sort of had lots of media appearances. He's been very active. He's been, releasing older rice that's been stockpiled from a few years ago, and saying, oh, this is just as good to eat, and encouraging people to buy it, encouraging people to release rice into the system sooner. He's been doing bold things like potentially risking upsetting Japanese farmers by saying he would consider reducing the restrictions on foreign rice and let foreign rice come into Japan and be a bit cheaper and more widely available, and potentially, whether he'd actually do that. But, the fact that he was willing to threaten that is a bit bold, to sort of encourage, the supply chain to get rice into the system to stop that happening. So he's had a very front and center role recently, and he's been more of a Ishiba ally. And also, Ishiba said something quite interesting in his resignation speech, which is he wanted to hand the baton on to the next generation. And whereas Sanae Takaichi is only slightly younger than Ishiba, she's 64 to his 68. Koizumi is a much younger man, and he's only 44. So you could argue maybe he's indicating that he's more supportive of a minister who he's had support him in the past in previous elections. It could just be an innocuous turn of phrase, but you could argue that maybe he's subtly indicating that he's who he would prefer to win, or perhaps another young candidate. He's also got very good pedigree, Koizumi, in the sense that his dad was a former Prime Minister of Japan and leader of the LDP as well. And it's quite common for Prime Minister of Japan to have a parent be either a very prominent figure in the government or even be a Prime Minister. So he ticks that box as well. But he's as I say, he's fairly young. He's had roles in the cabinet before. I believe he was the Environment Minister, and he's got sort of this media profile of where he's like appearing quite often in the news. He's more media friendly, quite savvy. So he's a potential good candidate for that reason. Now, before I look at some of the other candidates who could potentially run, there's also another question to consider, which is, could there be an early general election in Japan as well as this special leadership election? Now, I tend to think not, because I think there's sort of this very recent negative example of, as I say, Ishiba coming in 2024, immediately calling an election and losing it, and losing the party's majority. So it's a very recent negative example. And so I think there's a lot of pressure not to do that, given that LDP are in a little bit of difficulty. They face losing votes to Sanzeto potentially, and other sort of parties. So I think there's a real risk if whoever comes in wants their own mandate and calls an election immediately. And it's been such a short time since the 2024 election as well. And I just think also it's unlikely because there's so many options. Whoever the next leader of the LDP is, if they don't want to face the problem that Ishiba had of, working with Komeito alone and struggling to get legislation through, there's so many other potential parties they could work with. If it's someone like Koizumi, who's more centre and moderate, they could work with, the DPFP, they could work with Ishin, who've to some extent been willing to negotiate on getting specific legislation through in the past. Maybe they could go to them and say, if we give you these specific key policies, would you be willing to work with me? And maybe enter a formal coalition, which would make it really comfortable for the LDP to get legislation for you in future, and maybe a bit of an easier time than Ishiba had. If it's more of a moderate like Koizumi, that's something they could do. Whereas if it's Sanae Takaichi, it would be, a lot easier to approach Sanzeto. That might upset Komeito potentially, and say, we're the two right wings parties. Wouldn't you like your first taste of power? Wouldn't you like to come into a coalition? And we can give you a prominent place, and we can get some, more right-wing legislation through if it's a candidate from the right of the party, like Sanae Takaichi. But as I say, I think there's so many options for coalitions, and there's such a deterrent in terms of the last election, and potentially it would be such a risk having changed leader twice in a relatively short period of time to come in, have another election when the voters aren't quite sure what they're getting and they're already a little bit uncertain about the LDP. I just can't see another election quite so soon, but perhaps I'm wrong, and perhaps they think like Ishiba, they need their own mandate, and they just want to not go through the coalition process and just decide to throw it into the throw things into chaos, and figure it's worth taking the risk. Why not? And think they can win an election. So with that said, now we've covered sort of the main frontrunners in Takaichi and Koizumi. Let's look at some of the other possible candidates who haven't declared but might well enter this election and could put themselves forward as a potential LDP leader and prime minister. And it'd be very interesting if we got someone other than these two frontrunners who've long been speculated about as, you know, the potential next prime minister to succeed Ishiba. It'd be very interesting if it was one of them who to sort of come through and surprise people and become the next prime minister. Now, there's one candidate at the time of recording who's the first to declare. He's sort of beaten the Russian and be the first to put his name down, which is maybe an advantage in sort of the media game to have, a day or so of where you're the only one to officially enter and people are speculating and he's the only one they can talk about as an official candidate. So perhaps a savvy move in that respect. And that is Toshimitsu Motegi. Now, he's been around in the LDP for a while, and generally he's been in the House of Representatives since 1993, so he's got a long track record. He's held a number of roles. He's held the ministries of the economics and trade, foreign affairs, and he's also served as the secretary of the Liberal Democratic Party. So I think that potentially last role could be one possible mark against him, because I believe he was the secretary of the LDP at the time when the slush fund scandal was coming to light, and so I think that's maybe a sort of a bad mark against his record, that there's sort of the reason Ishiba, a large part why he succeeded being elected, was he's sort of been an outsider of the LDP and he wasn't associated with this slush fund scandal. So to be someone who was sort of at the helm as the secretary, it's not perhaps not fair to say he was the only figure you should look at in that respect, but he was the secretary as this news was coming out, which perhaps is, in the media world, a mark against him. That's something people might associate with him. Now, he entered the 2024 election, and I believe he only got 6.39% of the votes in the first round, so he wasn't a major contender in that election. And since then, I don't believe he's served in any official post in the year or so that Ishiba's been in office, so he's not had a chance in that respect to sort of get himself back into prominence. So unless he's sort of a good wheeler or a dealer, he might be sort of seen as a little bit of an outsider in the space of a year to come through and be a major candidate. But as I say, he's made this sort of interesting play of being the first to declare. So in that sense, he's got a bit of a head start on everyone. So it'll be interesting to see how he does. The next candidate I'd like to discuss is Yoshimasa Hayashi. Now, he's another fairly long-standing politician. He's been, I believe, in the House of Councillors. He was in since 1995, before entering the House of Representatives later in 2021. And he's had some fairly prominent roles as well. He's served as the Minister of Defence, Minister of State for Economic Policy, amongst other roles, including the Farming Ministry, which now Koizumi has.
Now, he also entered the 2024 election, getting 8.84% of the vote and being eliminated in the first round. However, though, since being eliminated, he was able to stay on in the cabinet, and he served as the chief secretary under Ishiba for the year or so that he's in office. So he's retained sort of a prominent ministerial role for that time. Another possible candidate who might be running is Takayuki Kobayashi. Now, he's a little bit on the younger side. He's 50 years old, and he's also been in. So he's more of a slightly recent entrance. He's entered the House of Representatives in 2012, I believe. And he served as the Minister for Economic Security as a role in the LDP government. So it'd be interesting to see how he would line up and what level of support he would draw and what he would bring to this contest as well. Another candidate who potentially could enter this new race is Taro Kono. Now, he's also a long-serving candidate and has served in a number of roles. He first entered the House of Representatives back in 1996. Now, he served a number of roles under Shinzo Abe. He served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Defence, so, two very prominent roles. He's also previously served in the Minister for Digital Transformation as well under Kishida. Now, he entered the 2021 leadership contest, and he had a fairly prominent role in that contest as well. When Prime Minister Suga was stepping out and sort of leaving his role as Prime Minister and leader of the LDP, he announced his candidacy, and there was sort of speculation that he was sort of the favoured successor by Suga to step in and replace him. And in the first round, he did very well, finishing just behind the eventual winner, Kishida, getting 255 to his 256 votes. But he ended up losing in the runoff to Kishida, who became the leader. Now, he also ran again in 2024 against Ishiba, but he didn't have quite such a prominent role this time. He ended up going out in the first round, and he only attracted 22 votes on that occasion, so a bit of a decline. But, people tried Ishiba. It's a different environment to what it was in 2024, so perhaps having previously been quite a prominent candidate, now a year later, it might be a quite different conversation if perhaps there's a room outside of the two considered front runners of Takaichi and Koizumi. The next candidate is Katsunobu Kato. Now, he also was in the 2024 election and just finished just behind Taro Kono. He got 16 votes and also went out in the first round in that election. Now, he first entered the House of Representatives in 2003. Now, he's the current Minister of Finance, and he's also had a few other prominent roles. He was the Chief Cabinet Secretary. He's been Minister of Health, Labour and Welfare, and he also had the ministerial role for addressing the falling birth rate as well. So he's had a few roles in his time in the House of Representatives since 2003. Now, as I say, he didn't do particularly well in the 2024 election, but since that time, in October 2024, he assumed the prominent role as the Minister of Finance, serving under Ishiba. So perhaps that's pushed him into a more prominent spot, and he could offer something a bit different in this election going forward if he decides to put his name into the mix and run as a candidate as well. So it'd be interesting to see if he enters the run and having this more prominent position, he might attract a bit more attention and interest than he did in 2024. Now, of course, these are by no means an exhaustive list. Other candidates could, of course, enter, but those are just a few prominent possible names I just wanted to have a quick look at. So yeah, it's all very exciting, really. Ishiba's just suddenly gone after speculating for a little while that he might leave, and we wish him the best, and it'll be interesting to see who becomes the next leader of the LDP and Prime Minister of Japan, of course. But yeah, that rounds out the show, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to this post Ishiba episode of the Japan Politics Podcast. I've been your host, Luke Whitaker. Thank you so much for listening. Sayonara, goodbye.